Hey, Randy Sullivan here, Florida Baseball Armory. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of hip to shoulder separation. I think it might be getting a little corrupted because I think people are kind of the idea that maybe more is better. And I'm going to try to make the argument that maybe the way you get there is really important, okay? So is necessarily more separation better? I'm not sure. It really comes down to finding your optimal length. Remember that every muscle has a length at which it's the most productive. My biceps is weak here because it's too long. It's weak here because it's too short, but in the middle it's super strong. And so we have the length tension curve that's really famous. And what happens is we want to be hovering with all our muscles somewhere around the ascending limb of that length tension curve. We want to be on the way up so we can activate them at the best possible time. If we get over here on the passive side, we get too much stretch. Now we can't harness the energy quick enough. We run into rate of force development problems and we can't get enough force out of the muscles. So we want to be hovering around that ascending limb. So we need to get our muscles at the right length, okay? Now, finding that optimal length is pretty tough, especially in the abdominals, because factors that influence the bandwidth of optimal length for muscle are, for example, short and fat muscles have a very narrow bandwidth of optimal length. Likewise, muscles with orientation of the fibers that is diagonal or pinnate to the direction of pull, those muscles tend to have a very narrow bandwidth of optimal length. And finally, muscles that have a lot of fascia and non-contractile tissue interwoven into them, those muscles also tend to have a very narrow bandwidth of length, of optimal length. And you can see here that the abdominals really, the rectus abdominis, the external obliques, the internal obliques, and also the transverse abdominis, all have a lot of fascia interwoven into them, and many of their muscles come in at oblique angles to the line of pull. And for that reason, the abdominals are very finicky. We call them the divas of the system. They have a very super narrow bandwidth of optimal length. Now the abdominals are critical because they transition energy from the lower half to the arm. Now the transition occurs when the front foot hits the ground. Pitching begins as a low intensity movement, but as soon as the front foot hits the ground, the high intensity phase transition happens, and now we start running out of options, especially because if we're going to transfer energy, when the front foot hits the ground, we need to have the abdominals at their optimal length. So the key is finding your perfect length. Now, in agility, there are two ways to rotate in tight spaces. Number one is called real rotation, and that is a situation where the hips and the shoulders rotate in the same direction. Now, that's pretty much the go-to for a swing for a hitter, hips, then shoulders. But you can also have a false rotation where the hips and shoulders go in opposite directions. Everybody's seen this viral video of Dak Prescott, working on his hip to shoulder separation. Well, that's an okay thing, but in agility situations, for me, the false rotation where the hips and shoulders go opposite directions tends to be more of an emergency plan. For example, if Dak has a collapsing pocket and needs to get a pass out to an outlet receiver, that's probably a really good pattern for him to have because he can get it. He can be really fast with it. He can recruit it really quickly. But if he has a wide receiver open on a skinny post down the field and he has a clean pocket, he's probably going to go real rotation, hips, then shoulders. Okay, so both of them are good. Both need to be really ready. For hitters, you need to have both in the arsenal. In agility situations like football and soccer and rugby, we need to have both available. But we also, in pitching, we tend to go hip to shoulder separation. We try to get too much, and we get too much false rotation. And so what happens is guys chase more. What we want to do is find everybody's perfect length, and that's different for everybody. And so how do you find your Goldilocks optimal length in your abdominals? You have to get to the place where you get here, and the magic, I think, happens in the hip lock. I think if we chase it in the distal segment up here in the trunk, we get lost in this too much stretch, and then we can't harness the energy fast enough. I think the way to find your optimal is with the vaunted hip lock. So what is a hip lock? Well, we get this from the runner's world. Great runners, when they sprint, when they get to full extension of their hip here, they co-contract all the muscles around their hip, and it stops the pelvis from rotating forward in the transverse plane. So for example, in running, here's a hip lock, and here's one that's unlocked. In pitching, here's a hip lock, and here's one that's unlocked. So we want to stop the pelvis from rotating forward, and that's why we work so much on hip locks, co-contraction of all the muscles at full extension. And that's going to do two things. It's going to stop the pelvis from rotating, but it's going to begin to get me my perfect stretch through my abdominals, not the distal segment, but through the proximal segment. And so we have to be able to go from the hinge to a hip lock to find optimal separation there. And then we have to get our chest out while we rotate, and those two go together. If we don't get a good hip lock, or we try to get too much separation. See, the abdominals can move in 3 planes, right? They can move in the transverse plane, they can move in the sagittal plane, and they can move in the frontal plane. And so if we get too much separation in the transverse plane, or not enough, too much separation in the transverse plane, in the sagittal plane, or not enough, or too much in the frontal plane, or not enough, the abdominals are going to be like, I'm not helping you transfer energy because I don't like the way my dress looks. We have to find that perfect place for our divas. And so if we get too much transverse plane separation, looking for the vaunted hip to shoulder separation, we eliminate the possibility of getting your chest out, which is another important attractor, is getting your chest out, because that adds the last touch of makeup in the sagittal plane to the divas. And so if we have too much transverse plane separation, then what we have to do is we have to revert to lumbar extension and not thoracic extension. Thoracic extension is critical because it drives the shoulder blade down toward the back pocket to help me get the head of the humerus seated in the socket and get layback. If I don't get my chest out, I tend to push the ball forward. Okay, so we got to go from hinge to hip lock, and then at that moment we also got to get our chest out so that we don't revert to lumbar extension. Okay, so we want to make sure that the thoracic extension is what's occurring, the vertebrae that have ribs, and not the lower back. And so that puts the last touch of, and so I think this combination of hip lock and thoracic extension helps every guy find his Goldilocks, his perfect. We got to find the one that works for you, and everybody's different, right? So I think if you chase it from the proximal segment, the pelvis, and then get your chest out, I think that's really a better way to find your perfect. And it's really critical too then that we train hip lock and chest out together. And so here we have some examples of ways to do that. You can see Ari here is going from his hinge into the hip lock. The wall is giving him the feedback on his hip lock. If he doesn't have a hip lock on the backside hip right here, then he's not going to be able to hold that stability in the wall, and he'll just fall over. And so that feedback from the front leg gives us the information we need to establish a really good hip lock. And you can see the band here is also helping him facilitate some thoracic extension while he's working on the hip lock. Here's another example. We go to a water ball now. We go from the hinge to the hip lock, and then he rotates the ball back toward his backside shoulder, and like as if he's dumping it over his shoulder to get chest out, thoracic extension, while we work on hip lock together. And then we start putting it all together in more of a pitching movement. We go off the box, down, across, and then so here we are, hip lock, land, chest out, and then rotate around. And that hurdle is helping us also facilitate the hip lock, because we can't get over the hurdle and get swing leg retraction if we don't get into a hip lock. And so I think it's really critical to understand that hip to shoulder separation is good, but chasing too much in one plane can be corruptive. And so creating an environment that helps every athlete find their perfect is crucial. I think working from the proximal segment outward is always the best way to go. And so we want to work from the pelvis out, not chase it in the upper body. And we want to work hip lock and chest out while rotating simultaneously. So if you want to learn more about our process and how we approach things a little bit differently from this motor learning and skill acquisition approach, this ecological dynamics approach that's grounded in anatomy and makes a lot of sense, then feel free to reach out to us. Check us out at FloridaBaseballArmory.com, or give us a call at 866-STRIKE-3. That's 866-787-4533, and we'll get you set up for a program to come in here and get you evaluated and get you started on your path to greatness. Thanks a lot.